It's 6 a.m. and John is woken by the light pouring in from the window of his tent. In a week's time, the British military will orchestrate the testing of Grapple X. This will be the fourth nuclear bomb they've tried to detonate successfully here in the Pacific, all in an effort to arm themselves in case the Cold War turns hot. As the sun starts to come up, Christmas Island's vast sea of coconut trees begins to frame the landscape. John is on his way to his workstation where he serves as a medical orderly. Here, he accompanies and assists doctors and nurses with minor practices. His colleague types up a safety report. With the Grapple X test only a week away, they need to be ready for any potential complications. Today they've been granted a day off as a reward for their hard work. They're going to venture to Manulu Lagoon for a swim. This lagoon presides just south of the Christmas Island airfield. Some of the men on the island have been here since the spring of 1957, when Britain was tested on Malden Island. But John arrived here in late September for the Grapple X and Y tests. The drive to the lagoon had become very familiar, with its winding narrow road surrounded by coconut palm trees and a sea of lush green grass. On any other given day, John would have to put his camera away now. They were entering the areas of the island in which preparations would be made to monitor the blast from the Grapple X. The island was usually quiet and peaceful. The main inhabitants of the island were located in the north. But for the duration of the tests, the Gilbertese population that lived on Christmas Island had been moved away. Once they arrived at the lagoon, they immediately got in to take a dip. They made the most of their time here. Soon they would be witnessing the first of two tests that they'd have to take part in on the island. They relaxed, laid back, and enjoyed each other's company. Stood looking out at the Bay of Wrecks, John reflected on his time at Christmas Island. Today is his last full day here before he departs for Hawaii. It was common for soldiers to receive a recreational trip away, as compensation for having to stay another year on the island. But as John and the other medical team arrive for just the X and Y tests, they're being treated to a visit to the United States as their effort concludes. The past 6 months on Christmas Island had been hard, especially the final days. The Grapple Y bomb, while successfully yielding 12.6 petajoules, had been detonated during the wet season. For days it had rained over the island, and many of the men were starting to feel sick. They had been told that it was merely just the weather getting to them, and they had no need to worry about potential fallout from the blast entering the water. John's friend here had been made to drive through the fallout to collect contaminated equipment for testing. In previous tests, the men were equipped with high-grade protection, but recently they'd been going out in nothing but shorts and sandals. These men were instructed to camp only half a mile from Ground Zero, where the Grapple Y bomb had been detonated. They'd been telling John about the blast. They seemed jubilant to be telling the tale and enjoying their time. But John feared they were masking troubled emotions. They had mentioned that you could see the bones in your hands when the light had flashed. John was just glad that he was away from it all. He had been making rum using the fallen coconuts that had been blown off the trees in the blast. Either way, their time here was coming to an end, and all they could do now was reflect on it and look forward to a visit to America. They played football and caught fish. It was a happy ending to what was, in John's mind anyway, an exciting journey across the world, but one he was glad was coming to an end. He would miss aspects of it though, the kittens at the camp, the beautiful scenery, and his rum. But he longed for his family and friends, and the familiarity of the Derbyshire Dales. As the sun started to come down over base camp, with many of the tents already taken down, John said his final goodbyes to paradise. John had now for the first time in nearly a year been exposed to civilian life. His service on Christmas Island had come to an end and he would soon return home. As he walked by the runway of Honolulu Airport, John reflected on his time on Christmas Island. The image he held in his mind was covered in coconut trees, blue skies and seas. He now viewed a sea of tarmac, framed by mountains and low cloud. Three women stood with a gentleman, waving goodbye to a departing flight. John overheard one of them weeping. Perhaps this was a long goodbye, he thought. When sat on the plane, John remembered how unfond of flying he is. The nervousness of being placed in a metal tin can flying thousands of feet above ground. They were waiting on the runway for some time, which presented an opportunity to settle down. This was his third time flying, and the previous two had been rocky to say the least. Perhaps third time would be the charm. As the plane climbed higher and higher, John took in Hawaii. Its volcanic mountains and lush green scenery. This was his final moments in the Pacific. Once at a high enough altitude, and the plane had settled after the climb, John had the opportunity to grab some reading material. Whilst he read, a stewardess attended to someone a few rows ahead of him. John took this opportunity to take a snapshot of the woman engaged in conversation. It was safe to say that John quite admired her, but he did so from the comfort of his seat and behind the lens of his camera. As they flew across the Pacific Ocean towards the United States, another flight went by beneath them. Wondering where they could be flying to, John decided the plane was veering off northward towards Washington State. As they began to descend into San Francisco, the highways and grid design residential areas of America invited them into the country. We return to John in New York City. Upon arrival, he found his final roll of film hidden in his luggage. It meant that he was unable to capture any images of San Francisco, but now had the opportunity to take a snapshot of the states here. From up high, he could see pedestrians crossing the street. Stockbrokers, admin, police officers, the employees of Tiffany & Co., all going about their day. He assumed that these were their professions anyway. The first thing he noticed about New York was the unfamiliar soundtrack of constant car horns and engines, distant sirens and the rambling voices climbing up the walls. It was a far cry from the natural landscapes of Derbyshire he was used to, and even more the tranquility that Christmas Island had presented over many months. John viewed buildings so tall that they touched the clouds. He had heard about skyscrapers and seen them in photographs, but had never witnessed them with his own eyes. Down on ground level, John walked by shimmering saloon cars and impressively dressed pedestrians. Here you could feel the grandiosity of the city, the thousands of people cramming onto the sidewalks travelling from A to B. Once he had taken in as much as he could handle, John called a taxi sporting a yellow exterior. From the car he could still see great views of the city and the skyscrapers peeking out above apartments. He saw a glimpse of the Chrysler building in all its grandeur. John was in his garden after returning from the States and the nearly year-long operation he had been on in the Pacific. He'd gifted his mother a Pan Am cabin bag that was given to him before boarding his flight out of New York City. Using the end of his film, he wanted to photograph her in the garden where she had kept these plants and flowers in such good condition whilst he was away. They normally shared this task, but it was mainly her responsibility. Now that he was back in England, John wanted to settle in quickly. He'd been away for such a long time and had missed the green valleys and quaint villages of the Derbyshire countryside. He visited his closest friend's garage. John found him, and somewhat unbeknown to him, working on a motorcycle. They were tending to an issue with the engine, but were just about to finish. John had planned to catch up with his friend and go on a picnic with him and their close family. They would travel to a nearby hill through the green landscapes and narrow dirt roads which he had sorely missed. Up upon the hill, they sat and enjoyed a collection of sandwiches prepared shortly before leaving. John's friend was what his mother would call a scream, eccentric and very funny. They were constantly witty and this amused John. They were also very happy to pose for John as he went through the rest of his film. Here they read a copy of a motorcycle newspaper. They also brought along their dog. It sat posed with him upon the hill. John had been accompanied by some kittens on Christmas Island. Not one usually fond of pets, John had now developed a sort of affection for them. The next day, John and his friend travelled to Ely in Cambridgeshire. They climbed the famous cathedral, painted by J.M.W. Turner in 1796. From up here they could get a great view of the city. John was reminded of his time in New York, looking down at people from such a great height. But there was a much more peaceful atmosphere here, less car horns and the bustling noises of everyday happenings. Here in Ely it was much calmer. You could see across the city and out towards the countryside. In New York, your view would be obstructed by skyscrapers. But John was on top of the world here. He could see for miles and miles. John stood on top of the cathedral and pondered over the journey he had been on the past year. He travelled across the world to unfamiliar destinations in the Pacific Ocean. He'd been there when weapons of mass destruction had been detonated. He had visited America and seen the New World, but now that he was back home, he could hold on to those memories in the comfort of a familiar environment, one that he hoped would remain peaceful and fulfilling.